Catecholamines, noradrenaline and adrenaline stimulate adrenoceptors. The receptor distribution determines the response. That's a very important sentence. So the receptor distribution determines the characteristic response. In other words, in our example in the heart, we saw that when beta-1 adrenoceptors are stimulated, they set off a particular pathway or a signal transduction pathway that leads to an increase in force of contraction. Now, if that had been a different kind of receptor, it may have been linked to a different signal transduction pathway, leading to a different biological effect. So you can see that if you have different receptors in different parts of the body, each may stimulate something differently. Yeah? In other words, with one stimulation, you can get different kinds of effects, depending on the kind of receptors and the pathways involved. So effects in any given organ will depend on the balance between alpha and beta receptors and their respective subtypes. Now, what does that mean? There's a little table here. This is a table showing different kinds of adrenoceptors. They're sometimes called adrenergic receptors, so it's the same thing. And you can see that in this little diagram, there are 4 different kinds of adrenoceptor. We've got alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2. Now, if we just look at a few characteristics, if we look at alpha 1, it produces vasoconstriction. So, you could speculate that when I run, I would want vasoconstriction in the gut. So maybe I have alpha 1 in the gut. Okay? On the other hand, we know that when we run, our skeletal muscle, the blood vessels there, needs to dilate, don't they? So we might look across here, we might say, oh, here, look at this. Beta 2, vasodilation. Okay? Beta 1, we've talked about, haven't we? We know that it produces tachycardia and increased contractility. So that's an example, we know that. It's interesting that beta 1 and beta 2, for example, in the lungs, cause bronchodilation. What's bronchodilation? Yeah. So, for example, many of you know people who suffer from asthma. And one of the things asthmatics do is they take a couple of puffs of Ventolin, salbutamol inhaler. Now, salbutamol is a selective beta-2 agonist, so it will affect the bronchioles. You'll be able to breathe more easily, but not much of an effect in the heart, because salbutamol is a beta-2, not a beta-1 agonist. On the other hand, if you get something like isoprenoline or adrenaline, and you treat that same asthmatic, what happens there is, sure enough, you get bronchodilation, but you also get effects in the heart, which is not what you want, is it? You want the heart to be happy and content. Meanwhile, the lungs can take on more oxygen in an asthmatic setting. So that gives you some idea about why it's important and why pharmacologists in particular work hard to try and distinguish different receptor types in different organs and how they work, so that you can develop drugs that are much more selective in their actions, and those drugs can affect the organs that you want to target and not other organs as well. You see the idea? So it's not just painful learning these things, it's also useful. And I'm sure that over time we will discover many more kinds of receptor, and we'll be able to develop many more selective drugs to target exactly where we want to target and not everywhere. You see the idea? So if you look at adrenoceptors, you can see from this table that there are at least 4 different varieties, 2 alphas and 2 betas. And if you just take one example of that, let's say beta 1 and beta 2, you can see that adrenergic stimulation in the heart will cause speeding of the heart and increased contractility, and we know the mechanisms there. Meanwhile, stimulation of beta 2 will produce bronchodilation of the lungs. Now, of course, when you're running, you need both of those to operate, don't you? So the adrenaline's a good thing. Noradrenaline's a good thing because on the one hand, you get the increase in the heart force and rate. The other thing, you get bronchodilation, so you can take in more oxygen. That can be delivered by this increased cardiac output by hemoglobin. It can be delivered to muscles that you're used for running, and there's more blood going to those muscles now as well. So it all works nicely, doesn't it, together? And it's all logical, actually. You don't need to know much before you can predict what's going on. So these are just some characteristics of sympathetic nerves. Where do they come from? Come from there. What are the transmitters? Preganglionic is acetylcholine and postganglionic is noradrenaline. And what do I mean by that? I'll explain in a moment. And you can see that the postganglionic neurons are generally long, originating the sympathetic chip. So these are just, this is the parasympathetic transmitters of both acetylcholine, and the postganglionic neurons are generally short. So if we look at that, here it is. Here we've got the parasympathetic. Here we've got the sympathetic. Up here we've got the preganglion. This is a ganglia. These are ganglia here. So this is preganglionic. This is postganglionic. And here we've got preganglionic and postganglionic. That's just terms. And what you can see very clearly here is that the preganglionic tend to be quite short, just like I said, and these release acetylcholine here. The postganglionic tend to be long, and they release noradrenaline or norepinephrine. Meanwhile, the parasympathetics, the preganglionic fibers coming from the brain tend to be long, and the postganglionics are very short, often located in the organ. And they both release acetylcholine, 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 noradrenaline. Yeah? Is that okay? Yes. Finally, this diagram tries to bring some of these ideas together. And down at the bottom, we've got cardiac output. We know that cardiac output is a product of stroke volume and heart rate. Yeah? We know that heart rate is controlled by parasympathetic and sympathetic. Parasympathetic slows down, sympathetic speeds up. Yeah? Blue increases or stimulates, red reduces or inhibits. So parasympathetic reduces or inhibits heart rate. Sympathetic stimulates heart rate. Meanwhile, on this side, we can see that sympathetic increases contractility, so positive inotrope, and will increase the force of contraction, won't it? Yeah? So if we just take an example of a crisis situation at the top, it's an exercise, it's physical or emotional trauma, it's an increase in body, whatever the crisis is, what does it do? Well, it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, doesn't it? Come down here, what does it do? Increases the sympathetics, increases heart rate. Yeah? On the other side, something we haven't talked about much, but maybe you've heard of muscle pumps and respiratory pumps. Have you heard of that? So in other words, when I run, there's a venous return from the legs, isn't there, to the heart. But when I run, within those veins, there are like little valves. And every time the muscle of the legs contract, it moves blood up the veins, and the valves stop the blood falling down again. So that's what I mean by muscle pump. Similarly, when I breathe in, that creates like a vacuum, doesn't it, around the heart, and it tends to promote venous return. When I breathe out, it kind of increases the pressure, so the venous return is not so facilitated. That's what I mean by respiratory pump. And you can see that noradrenaline or stressful situations increase the activity of these pumps. What does it do? It increases the blood volume returning to the heart. If you increase the venous return and the end diastolic volume, you know by Frank Starling, if the preload increases, you increase the stroke volume, don't you? Yeah, you see that? Okay. Imagine now that the crisis has passed, we've done our running, we're sitting down now to relax. So the crisis has passed, now the parasympathetic system comes into play. The sympathetic quietens down, the parasympathetic slows down the heart, so therefore the cardiac output will be reduced. Okay, so it just gives you some idea. Hemorrhage here, look. Hemorrhage, excessive sweating. If we have low, imagine you cut yourself very badly and you lose a lot of blood. What's going to happen? The pressure is going to fall, isn't it? In comes that little video clip that I've just shown you. Feedback from baroreceptors tell the brain, oops, pressure is low. Sympathetic stimulate the heart to try and maintain the pressure. But what else does low blood pressure do? It also increases activity of the kidneys. What do the kidneys do? The kidneys regulate fluid balance, don't they, of the body? Yeah? So the kidneys receive the blood, filter the blood, and then decide how much fluid is lost as urine and how much is retained. Inside that water fluid is salts, sodium chloride, all this stuff, isn't it? So, what happens here, if there's low blood pressure, for example, due to hemorrhage, loss of blood, there's increased renal activity. The kidneys conserve sodium and water. Basically, if they conserve sodium, water follows sodium. That's this. Water always follows sodium. You increase sodium, water follows. So what does that do? It increases the blood volume, this, because we're passing less now as urine, means we're keeping more in the body, and this will increase the venous return, this will increase the preload, this will increase contraction, this will increase cardiac output, which will increase blood pressure. See the idea? It's easy, what do you think? I mean, this diagram looks like nasty spider's web, but actually, if you think about it, it would be easy to recreate. This diagram. Yeah? Happy? Yeah? Good. Okay, I think that's it. Yes.